Hi, and welcome. You're listening to Trustees Without Borders, a podcast production of the Virginia Tech Institute for Policy and Governance. I'm your host, Andy Morikawa, at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. Today's program features Dr. Karen O'Brien. Dr. Karen O'Brien is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at the University of Oslo, Norway. Joining me are the interviewers for today's show, Kathy Grimes and Laura Nagel. Kathy and Laura, would you introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Hi, I'm Kathy Grimes, and I am the Communication Director for the graduate school here at Virginia Tech. In my former life, I spent 20 years as a journalist. I covered environmental and educational issues, and I did a lot of explanatory and investigative journalism. I earned a master's degree in communication here at Virginia Tech, and my particular interests are in how language is used, speech code theory, and also how language can encourage people to use their agency most effectively.
And I'm Laura Nagel. I'm working as the community-based research manager at the Virginia Tech Institute for Policy and Governance.
Great, thank you. Our guest, Dr. Karen O'Brien, is an internationally recognized expert on climate change and society, focusing on themes such as climate change impact, vulnerability, and adaptation, including how climate change interacts with globalization processes and the implications for human security. She's interested in how transdisciplinary and integrated approaches to global change research can contribute to a better understanding of how societies both create and respond to change, and particularly the role of beliefs, values, and worldview in transformations to sustainability. She's passionate about what potential there is in quantum social theory and the implications for climate change responses. She's the co-founder and partner in Sea Change, an Oslo-based company. Sea Change is a beacon for individuals and organizations seeking a new perspective, inspiration, knowledge, and tools on climate change and sustainability transformations. Dr. O'Brien was named by Web of Science as one of the world's most influential researchers of the past decade in 2019 and 2020. In 2019, she received a Research Excellence Award from the AAG Human Dimensions Specialty Group. In 2021, she was co-recipient of the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award for Climate Change. Dr. O'Brien, welcome to Trustees Without Borders.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to talk with Trustees Without Borders.
Let me now turn you to our interviewers, Kathy Grimes and Laura Nagel. Kathy?
Karen, it is a delight to have you here. Your latest book's title, You Matter More Than You Think, Quantum Social Change for a Thriving World, is uplifting and intriguing at the same time. For our listeners who may be unfamiliar with your work, can you share what sparked your passion for addressing climate change and how you came to consider quantum social change as a means for individuals, communities, and society to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think, I've been working on climate change research for over 3 decades, looking at impacts, vulnerability, adaptation, and really what it means for humans. And I think once we understand what climate change means for society, we really have to look at how do we respond? How do we respond, or transform at the rate, the scale, the speed, and the depth that is called for by climate change science. And that led me to really thinking about, what is the role of our worldviews and our beliefs and our patterns of thinking. And when I came across quantum social theory and realized that there's a whole emerging body of research that is presenting a very different way of thinking about social change, I just thought, what does this have to do with climate change? And that really opened up an inquiry for me that continues to this day.
Thanks. From your recent article in the journal Ambio, you noted that in reflecting on the implications for management, governance, and policy, Liu et al. From 2007 recognized that hubris and human attitudes towards natural systems was an impediment for progress. At the same time, they acknowledged that humans are not sufficiently represented in ecological science. And I think this kind of ties into this understanding of and it's taken some people longer than others to understand that we need to acknowledge there's a shift of humans as drivers of climate change rather than passive recipients of it. Notably from the Industrial Revolution onwards. And so I think to get into it a little bit more, is there something unique about quantum thinking as a framework for social change that is particularly relevant for addressing the issue of climate change, which has so far been established as from the physical sciences as a major problem? And of course, there's all sorts of social issues intertwined, but entangled, but I think this question is getting at what is it about quantum thinking that is maybe establishing, for example, is it the fact that it's adapted from the physical sciences that makes it potentially more convincing or theoretically valid to the scientific community? Or does quantum help us think about our position within a global ecosystem more effectively than other social change theories or frameworks in some specific way?
Mm-hmm. I believe that quantum physics itself, it's really challenged our very nature and understanding of our relationship to the universe. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's fascinating because, it's over 100 years since the key discoveries in quantum physics, and we haven't really absorbed it yet as a society in what does this actually mean. We use the equations and algorithms and things very successfully, and we've created tools. But what's interesting to me is that it's been really being used, it has a lot to say for how we relate to the physical world. And so it's almost like the entry point for quantum physics tells us a lot about our relationship to science itself, and it brings the social and the science closer together from my perspective. And that has a lot to do with, how do we relate to something like climate change, where we are actually transforming the climate system, and we can't address it without recognizing that that we are in relation to that climate system. And it also has implications for how we relate to social systems, economic systems, political systems, and other systems. So I feel it's a really important entry point to raising questions and opening conversations about these really important relationships that are quantum physics, when you get down to it, is really kind of mind-blowing. Like, what is it telling us about the nature of reality, and what's our role as human beings in shaping that reality?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've got a follow-up question for that, because you've talked about, and it's not here, but you've talked about quantum theory as being, it's been around for a long time, and it's an entry point, and yet it's associated with math and science and education. So perhaps not everybody feels very comfortable. Even you mentioned quantum theory and they're going, whoa, that's way over my head. So we will bring in somebody else to deal with that. And they do not understand how they fit into this whole idea. So how do we bring it down to a level that it's accessible to everybody?
Yeah, I know that there's books, Quantum Physics for Babies, and things that are out, so it's getting out there widely, but just, to really recognize that, electrons and photons can be both waves and particles, that uncertainty is the nature of reality, that, there's like potential that, that from the there's many different interpretations of quantum physics, and no agreement on, what it actually, what is it telling us about the nature of reality. But I think with, common to all of those is that, that humans are not, the observers are not separate from matter. And that's why, the title of my book, You Matter More Than You Think. It's not just in terms of significance, but it's in terms of substance also. And they often say, nobody understands quantum physics, but I think the important thing is to raise those questions about, like, what does that actually mean if we don't understand the nature of reality, that we're transforming climate change. And I take that, like that we know scientifically that ice melts at certain temperatures and sea levels rise, and that these impacts are going to help us. But if you bring humans and their agency into, that our observations and measurements are actually collapsing a wave of potential into an actuality, into a reality, then, how, what is it then that, do we have some room for maneuvering to actually influence the future in a positive way? And to me, it gives us a wider and deeper space for actually, generating an equitable and a thriving world, because it doesn't just go into a deterministic, oh, that, here's where we are and here's where we're heading, and you don't matter. And I think many people, when they're confronted with climate change and quite an overwhelming problem, plus biodiversity loss, plus global inequality and pandemics and things, we really feel quite helpless.
Mhm.
And what a lot of the concepts from quantum physics of entanglement and complementarity and all there's a language to it that is actually quite useful in opening our minds and hopefully our hearts towards that, like, wow, there's a that we are actually inherently connected or entangled, and we're entangled with the problem of climate change and as the solutions to climate change.
What a great lead in to my next question. You've mentioned in your book and in your presentations 3 spheres of transformation. And you note how our current society seems fixated on the very first, the very central one, that entails practical, technical, measurable efforts to address climate change, rather than considering our personal and collective agency related to policies and politics, and our individual and shared capacity to influence change. Can you share what those 3 spheres are for our listeners? And then, and I know I'm going to mispronounce it, the noosphere and its relevance to this work.
Yeah, the 3 spheres of transformation is something I've been working with for like more than a decade, in really understanding, if we say we need to transform, how do we do it? And looking at transformation as a process and looking at different dimensions of it, the practical dimensions, the technical and behavioral aspects of it that we can observe and we can measure, and are very much aligned with that classical world that we live in. And we're looking for results. They're important. We have indicators, we have metrics and things. And yet, as we know, we're failing to meet many of the Sustainable Development Goals and targets and the Paris Agreement and things. And so it's often just not enough to be focusing only on the practical. Surrounding that is the political sphere, which are the systems and the structures. And these refer to the social and cultural norms, rules, regulations, infrastructure. It's really how we collectively organize society. And it's political because it's really about, it's not just an individual's choice, but it's a collective decisions about what we prioritize and how, and it very much influences the practical outcomes that we see day to day, month to month, and year to year. And often in the political sphere, we can get very much stuck in conflict and polarization and talking past each other, and it's a negotiated space, and it's not, and it's where it can be very political. We also see social movements emerging from this, where people say, wait a minute, we can create a different outcomes in different worlds. And often we're stuck in the political sphere because we pay very little explicit attention to the personal sphere. And by personal, I mean the individual and shared beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms through which we see the system and how we relate to the system. And, recognizing that we're not all talking about the same system when we talk about a global system or a water system or an agricultural system. We all draw our boundaries in different places. We all place ourselves in relation to a system differently. And that brings us, back to the quantum element of when we see that we're not just related to systems, but we are systems, and the individual is the collective. It's a different way of relating. And to me, that opens up a wider, different types of ways of looking at how transformations come about. And, paradigms are explicitly, really important. These are the kind of thought patterns that dominate the way that we think about science and society. And a lot of the paradigms in Western culture are still based on a very classical Newtonian understanding that is very, atomistic, deterministic, reductionist, and I think we don't necessarily take into account consciousness, free will, and subjectivity and our lived experiences, and how those influence how we engage in the political and the practical spheres. And in global change research, we talk a lot about the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, but we seldom talk about the noosphere, or our consciousness and mindsets, and really in relation to the biosphere, in relation to evolution. How do we there's a realm that's not included in the models, and I think that bringing that in is very important into, looking at how change happens. How do our thought patterns shift, and how do we adapt them to this very idea that we are changing the climate and that we are influencing the future, not just for decades and not just for centuries, but for millennia. And I think, it's a shift that I think is very important to start to see that, yeah, we matter right now in the moment.
Yeah, I have so many follow-up questions. Sorry. I think to go back to something that Kathy brought up is the accessibility of quantum as a understanding how all of that language actually applies to reach a broader audience. In your book, you partnered with an illustrator. I'm going to mispronounce his name if I...
Tone Bjordam, an artist.
Yeah, right. And found that some of your readers actually resonated more with the images in comprehending some of the material. And so I wonder if, have you seen scholars or artists partnering to take the language of quantum and illustrate it, make it more visual and approachable to a broader audience? Because I think in some of our work too, we we'll have a full research report, but also we interpret it and distill it down in an executive summary for a general audience and use infographics and visuals and try to pull in other, materials to explain what our findings are. And so I wonder if that kind of project, I know you sort of explored that as you wrote the book. So.
I think that, just in looking up, on Spotify, there are songs about entanglement, and the artist Anthony Gormley has something on clouds that, there's a lot of things that depict this. And so we've been looking at, like in terms of art matters, that there's a lot of people that are expressing these ideas of entanglement, of uncertainty, of like the intra actions of ourselves, like that we aren't separate, but that we're connected. So I feel like the art realm, it gets beyond just the cognitive understanding and our struggle to cognitively understand it, to really, like that deep down in an embodied sense that it really, our relationship to nature goes really deep. And Tona's artwork in the book, I think, really captures that really nicely, whether, through the colors and designs, that not that nature is something separate from there, but that we are really connected to nature, and we are nature. And I think that's an important shift that we need in our culture, because both climate change and biodiversity loss are and pollution in general are really affecting not just the natural world out there, but us as well.
Yeah, and another follow-up, I was thinking through, what's a practical, perhaps just to think through a concept of a system like recycling, for example. It can be explored at the practical level or technical level, the political level, and then, the personal level, where how successful are our systems in actually delivering what we're intending. And with recycling, I think I read recently, only 5 to 10% of what is collected for recycling in the US is actually recycled. And there's several reasons for that. It has to do somewhat with how people contaminate the recycling stream. Then also there's no market for, there's not the incentives to recycle a lot of the materials. So it kind of touches on all of the levels that you just explored. And I guess I'm wondering, what's a similar model in climate change that we could kind of practically examine, at all of those levels. And honestly, and I think, again, even not hearing your talk, if you talk about these different levels and how the intergovernmental panel on climate change has thought through scenarios and modeled into the future what climate change is going to look like, factoring that human can, like, how is what we're going to do together as a collective going to impact that model is really not a variable in their models. And so kind of having alternative models to think through some of that, to make that picture more complete. And so that's just something that crossed my mind. And I think we do have a question that will get at that a little bit more. So, so back to the script. During your presentation at Brown University in April 2019, you suggested that we might not be asking ourselves the right questions as we consider climate change, noting that we need to inquire, what if social reality is not what it seems, and what if we are actually underestimating our collective capacity for social change? So how do we prompt such a reconsideration at the community or local level? And this is really, what practical steps do you think such might entail? How does it play out among communities as they're trying to figure this out?
Yeah, I think it's really important that, it's one thing for the physical sciences to say reality is not what it seems, at the subatomic level or something, but then that we actually, we have some very strict assumptions about social reality and the way that we are, and this is the way the world is, and these are the possibilities. This is possible, this is impossible. And for me, like quantum theory and the idea of quantum social change opens, it widens that space, and it asks us to challenge some of our assumptions and our beliefs about the way that the world is, and says, and open up to what if, and challenge those givens, because everything that, is occurring right now is really an outcome of earlier beliefs and interests, and the way we've organized society, the way that power relations have come about and everything. And we don't necessarily acknowledge, that these are just one possibility among many, and that there are these little turning points where we could actually change things quite dramatically. And so often, when we talk about climate change, we frame humans as the problems, and so it's very much that in a narrative form, we are the antagonists to the planet, and we don't save ourselves a space to be the protagonists for the ones. We are the solutions. We are the ones that come up with the renewable energy technologies and the different ways of organizing society, helping each other. There's so many things that we could actually place ourselves as the solutions to complex global problems. And in many ways, we're still in a very technical type of approach, and people kind of reduce themselves to it's just me, it's just my community, I just have a small scale project. It doesn't really, what is it going to matter if we do something here when country X, country Y, or corporation X or Y are doing this? And so we don't necessarily see ourselves as entangled with a larger system where, when one part of the system changes, the whole system by definition changes. And so I think it lifts up that, the significance of everything that we do. And because we're entangled, not, just as abstractly as particles, but through language, through meaning, through stories, through shared values, through the, context and things. And we are really, wired to connect as human beings. And if we take that, ask about, the nature of social reality, we can ask very different questions. So at a practical level, it's to, widen the possibilities for social change by looking at the alternatives that aren't right in front of us, but are kind of what some people refer to as the adjacent possible.
The alternate universe. I have a kind of a follow-up question to this, because I've in your book and also in some of your presentations, you've talked about the fact that often the scientific explanations for this and the stories that journalists write are based on past. They're based on what we've done, the cycles that have occurred in the past, and they don't look forward. And yet we get very caught up in, this is what it's been to this point, so this is what it's going to be again, so this is why should I even try and do anything? So how do we counter that to push people forward to thinking, okay, this is how it's been, but we have the agency and the ability, even if it's to start small, we can make some changes, and it doesn't have to continue being that.
Yeah, that's a great question, because we live in a very linear world, and it's that and we want to have actually, we want to see the results of what we do right now, right here and now. And as we know, the past does influence the future in terms of inertia in systems. So we will see the sea level rising for decades to come, because the water holds heat, and we will see temperatures rising. But what we do now is influencing that long-term change. And if we can really start to grasp that, rather than pushing sustainability off into the future, and we'll, for the 2030 agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals, let's start in 2029, or let's start talking about goals for 2050 or things. If we bring them right here and right now, and really think about, how do we create that sustainable, the sustainable and equitable world right here and now, we actually, we start a different momentum, a different inertia, and we move in a different direction. And I think it opens up for a lot of, I think it gives us more power in the moment than actually just a very disempowering narrative that tells us that there's nothing that we can do about this. So in my mind, it's about, we will have to adapt to changes of the to the impacts of climate change, and we will experience losses. And I think we have to acknowledge and accept and address those in many ways. But the possibilities that that we actually have right here and right now, and I opened the book with "This decade matters," because the science is telling us that we really have a window of opportunity to maintain warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or so. And so it really, we can't just drag the past into the future, nor can we just push the future off into the future. We actually have to deal with it right here and now.
And I think probably for everyone that means something different for them. How engaged they want to be, how much of their lifestyle they're going to change. I mean, it's an interesting, again, going back to practically, what does it mean for each individual? What kind of changes they're willing to make for that collective good. So we could have a conversation about that alone, I think.
And I would say that even, like Matt, it's not just about what you do, but it's also about what you don't do, and so that matters too, that I say like, and I say that, like, if you believe that you don't matter, that actually has huge ramifications for the way that we're moving forward collectively. And I think that, whether it's politically or economically or socially and things, that we are, like that you really underestimate your own our own collective impact on these systems. And so, at a practical level, it really is to, like kind of put ourselves in the one, like, okay, what does this mean naturally? So it brings us not just to like this idea that I have agency, but to the quality of agency. How am I expressing it based on what values? And if you're looking at a quantum system, it's the values that apply to the whole system, and that actually gives brings in like an ethical stance of responsibility to the whole. So it does, from a practical sense, it says that like what I do right here and now actually has ripple effects. It's in across time and space, both here and now, and here and now and in the future.
That brings me to one of those wonderful illustrations in your book where you have the ripple effects that look like raindrops, and just how everything. So again, the idea of the visual giving us a sense of potentially what our small things might add up to be. I wanted to ask you about your organization, Sea Change, which you've said is very active on social media and has attracted a number of people and organizations who also are very interested in this. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Sea Change is trying to accomplish and at what scale? And I'm going to add, and how do individuals factor into that?
Yeah, I think my colleague Linda Signa and I started Sea Change as a result. It was originally a research center proposal, and we tried to really do this at the universities, but we realized that that to actually engage society with the research that we're doing, and to do research not as usual, but to go in a different way, we actually had to set up something different. And so we started Sea Change in 2014 without really knowing exactly what we were aiming to do, but we knew that there was like a different message about transformations that had to come out, very much linked to, what is that relationship between individual change, collective change, and systems change, and how do we transform, at scale? How do we transform systems and cultures? What's my role in it? And so, working with schools, with municipalities, with businesses, with society in general, to really shape a different narrative and give, tools. So we do workshops. We present the research in a way that is more, I guess, actionable for people, and then in turn we really learn a lot about, okay, well, within a municipality there's so much going on. How do you actually increase the impact of this is happening? And so how do you go beyond like small scale and large scale to show that every municipality, every business, every neighborhood, every school, that we all are, part of this larger transformative change process. So it's really, for me, it's like a breath of fresh air to take, the research out, work with society for social change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some of our most meaningful projects are very much community oriented and community engaged, and because there's so much lived experience and knowledge and expertise out in the communities that we always end up learning something from any kind of technical assistance or research projects that we engage with. Speaking of schools and engaging the younger generations in this conversation, during the pandemic, we've read about several online citizen science projects, such as digitizing title records, that are the old handwritten, and so you just spend time plugging the numbers in. So we have a digitized record and can track changes in the tides over time, or scanning satellite photographs of the Arctic to identify walruses for the Walrus from Space project. Maybe these are small, trivial examples, but again, we all matter, and these different activities could maybe engage a broader audience in this conversation, especially younger people. So to what extent is citizen science a form of agency to address climate change?
Yeah, I think it's a really important form of agency. And like from the quantum perspective, if the measurement is what collapses the wave, then we want to look at the measurer, and we want to bring science out of being something for like experts and knowledge to like that's something that we do in everyday life, observations, analysis and things, and even like from whether you're making dinner to whether you're counting birds in your gardens, or noticing when it's when the first snowfall comes, or things like that. That's a really important part of our collective knowledge things. And that's how, for me, climate change, you can, it's a systemic problem. And a lot of people pick this or pick that, and you can say like, oh, it's not changing because of this or not that. But when you start to connect the dots, you start to see the patterns, and you start to see like that the patterns are continuing. And then, I think in terms of transformation, how do we disrupt patterns that are not serving humans and all species, and how do we recognize that there that we have these impacts. And so citizen science for me is a way of making all of us part of the we are all the observers, and that sense of agency, that we are all collapsing the wave in a certain way. So it's not just in the laboratories, but it's in life in general that science is important.
And I'm going to follow on that and ask, how do we take that down to the child level? Because children have such wonder, and they're very open to so much. Their idea, you can ask them about reality, and they have a million different realities that they can pull from at any given moment. So how do we bring children into the equation?
Yeah, I think your point there is they are natural scientists. Let's put the fork in the outlet and see what happens, and things. And you're like, wait, but maybe it's like where we stop that scientific inquiry. Where do we like break down the wonder of the world, and how do we socialize children into a very like a classical world of this is the way it is, and this is like to reduce the possibilities for like the connecting with nature, connecting with others, and really thinking differently about the future. And I think there's a lot of educational programs and things that are really working on that, but for me, it's the the education itself has to transform if we would like to transform society, because it's it's at the heart of where we're getting our ideas and experiences, and how we are socialized.
So not at all a trivial.
Yeah, not at all trivial. No.
Yeah.
So
that's a great answer. Wow. Okay, so we are already experiencing man-made climate change's effects today, with increased flooding, wildfires, and heat waves. For example, a recent study by First Street Foundation reports that a quarter of the roads and I think critical infrastructure such as hospitals and things in the United States would be impassable or inaccessible during a flood. So that's a lot of infrastructure for a variety of reasons, including both choice and out of necessity. We continue to rebuild in areas devastated by extreme weather events. And so there are regulatory mechanisms, this is going maybe to the technical or political, to reduce this potential, such as increasing the cost of flood insurance. But then at the personal level, how does that impact us in our agency? Unfortunately, such policies may disproportionately affect lower income households or communities of color or others. So how do the various levels of government regulation account for their implications for individual and collective agency, while also attempting to regulate for the greater good, which is, you'd like to think that maybe is the goal of government, but does it always, you know, again, looking at that recycling example, there's so many examples of systems that break down when they're actually applied within the context of human behavior. And the reality is that, you know, we don't face equitable realities within communities. So.
Yeah, and that goes into like, how are we designing our policies? How are we designing our recycling systems? And it is, you know, it's not like that there's one answer, but it's how, it's the adaptive dimension of it. How do we, when we see that, you know, does this work? But, you know, are we taking into account equity from the very beginning of every regulation to recognize that for some people it is going to be devastating? And it really comes down to, you know, how do we look at risk, and how do we look at it when we are the ones that are actually increasing the risk of flooding, of wildfires, and things, and that how do, you know, like the idea of burden sharing, you know, through insurance, but also of, you know, just restraining ourselves from where we might naturally want to still, you know, do the same thing we've done for years, and you know, living in high risk areas or doing high risk activities that are that we know will lead to you know, climate change that is dangerous for people and other species. Then I think that the you know, like for when we start to really adapt to that very idea that we are changing the climate, that we are responsible for the future, then, you know, we have to think about how do we design equitable and policies that reduce risk, but also you know, like kind of respond to the problems, but also realize the possibilities for other types of solutions. And, you know, I think that that's something that is, it needs a collective conversation about what we do, because for, as you pointed out, that a lot of the impacts that we're seeing right now are, they're probably more, yeah, I don't even know, like they're much greater than maybe what I anticipated 30 years ago. You know, I just thought like we'd still be looking at the statistics to see whether we're, you know, are the climate impacts, but we really see that the extremes are more extreme than we imagined. And so we don't really have the risk equations. And I know for years that the insurance companies and the reinsurance companies have been concerned about it, policymakers have been concerned about it. But when you add people in and our connection to place, our connection to, you know, like this is the way it always has been, and things, how do we switch that? And I think that that's where language and conversations will come in too, of because it's not there's no simple answer to these questions, because it's also very emotional, it's also economic, they're very they're complex and they're human.
And as you noted, they, you know, for insurance companies have been concerned for years, not particularly out of altruistic concern about their policyholders, but more about the fact that it costs a whole lot of money to keep rebuilding in places. So it's how do you also change that incentive and that outlook to be thinking more in terms of the people and not just what is happening with your bank account. There are many examples of governments using incentives to increase renewable energy production or adoption of clean energy technology, such as Norway's tax incentive for electric vehicles. NPR has reported that 9 in 10 cars now being sold in Norway are electric or hybrid. And I know in the United States, the number is going up as well, although there are some concerns about the fact that there aren't a whole lot of charging stations. So some of the things that you need to have that kind of switch don't exist yet. So how do such incentives interact with or mediate individual political agency? especially in the context of quantum social change.
Yeah, I think that like the example of electric cars in Norway is a really interesting one from the practical, political, and personal perspectives, because practically, it's like we have the technologies, and actually there was an electric car in Norway developed earlier that never went anywhere, and it wasn't until in the political sphere cars in Norway are taxed highly, and when they made subsidized electric vehicles, that they became first business people. They became the business cars, the people, and so there was an influx of electric cars, and if they became more and more popular, they could use the faster lanes for going. So there were a lot of incentives that got people buying electric cars, and eventually there was more traffic in the electric car lane than in the other lanes. But there are also then, from a social perspective, there's, those subsidies came at a cost too. And I read one article saying that you could have actually paid people to take public transport for the cost of those subsidies. And a lot of those electric cars are second cars. So, people have two cars, one to go to the mountains and things. And I think, that might be changing because at the same time, the infrastructure for recharging has increased. It is expanding in Norway and across the country and things, but it's not, it's still a paradigm where individual in a vehicle going, and it's not in terms of life cycle analysis, it's not necessarily the solution. So it's just one of them. So where I think, when you get to that personal sphere, where it actually shifts people is that they start to be more, when you start to think like, oh, I have an electric car, and you start to think about, other environmental things, it starts to put you in an identity of like, oh, I too am green and things. And of course, there's the irony of the person driving their electric car to the airport to go shopping in London or something, where you get these, sheer contradictions. But on the other hand, I've heard a lot of stories about that, that people are starting to, it opens up that awareness and that idea of just starting to, just question things and just go, how are we doing this? So for me, it's, it's a really interesting phenomena that electric cars and the electricity is driven by hydroelectric power. But we also have a shortage of, electricity is the cost is very high right now, which is threatening people, using it to heat their houses and things. And that's also because of globalization of the export of electricity to the European markets and purchasing back. And there's a lot more of complexity to the story there. And so, to make sure that you have the alternatives, that they're also developing the bicycle lanes and public transport, and, where is the investment in like trains, which have been, severely neglected over the past decades. So it's the idea of like in that political sphere, there's a lot of different potential solutions, but what we prioritize as the solution, it's really like the way we see the problem is the way that we see the solution. And if you see that cars are the solution, you might have electric cars, but you're still going to be building roads and bridges and that, and not investing in public transport or alternative ways of organizing society so people travel, can, live more locally.
Right, and the people who have the funds and the privilege to buy that second electric car, and maybe have a little flexibility to change their behavior. Are they really changing their behavior to meet some of these goals?
Yeah, and we have research PhD students working on these and looking at also car sharing things. So I think it's a really good study area for seeing how, like the, radical electrification of vehicles.
Yeah, but again, if the source of electricity is still fossil fuels, locally pollution is maybe improved, but you still there's all sorts of considerations there. So of course, climate change is in the news a lot lately. The Nobel Prize in Physics has gone to a climate scientist for the first time ever. It was recently reported that 9 of the world's 20 largest economies, including the US and EU, have agreed on a plan to restrict methane pollution, methane being very potent gas, more so than CO2. And the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference begins in about a week as the 26th Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. So sort of honing in on these global institutions that organize and speak I think that Conference of the Parties meets every year, right, since the 1990s.
Mhm.
And then of course the Paris Agreement was one of the landmark decisions that this party has made. And so this year, as you noted, there's expectations to develop ambitious 2030 emissions reduction targets. And maybe 2030 is even too far into the future, as you noted, but knowing that maybe we have about a decade to really limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I think, I guess the question we're getting at is, what do institutions such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the COP on Climate Change do well, and what could they do better in tackling climate change from a quantum perspective?
Yeah, and I think there's different dimensions here, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a relationship between science and policymakers that really, it's a negotiated text at the very end of the research assessments that almost helps to give policymakers the state-of-the-art understanding of where we're at. And then through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Conference of Parties and things, it's almost like, we have the marching orders from the science. So this is actually where we're at. This is what needs to be done and everything. And then it's up to the governments, to come up with these agreements. And of course, everyone has like different interests, and, competing commitments and different ways of seeing problems and framing solutions and things. But what I think is really interesting with the COP meetings also is that they get a lot of attention. There's also, there's a whole civil society, artists coming up and showing up, and it really, it generates for, 2 weeks in the year, a lot of conversation around climate change and how we deal with it. And this year, I think, every year it comes out like, this is critical, this is critical, this is critical. And I think more and more we're seeing there's a consensus among policymakers that, yeah, this is critical, but reaching those, like the exactly how do we transform? To me, that still is the question mark. How do we do this in an equitable and ethical way? How do we move forward and align our actions so that, we can address multiple problems, including, the COVID pandemic and biodiversity loss and things. So we have multiple institutions dealing with really important problems, but it all has to be very much aligned in the same direction. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, we have the roadmaps, we have the pathways and things, but to get us there, and that brings us into the quantum social change, is like bringing, like, you matter in the moment, and that this, and to change, to think about, as if we're entangled through language, and we're talking all different languages, we're living in different contexts. How do we come to an agreement, not just intellectually, but at the heart, that this is that the future really depends on what we do right now.
And could you, just for our listeners, I want to make sure they know what COP or COP is.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't.
Conference of the Parties.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we are clear on that, so we don't have somebody.
Yeah, it has other implications.
What are they talking about?
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a little bit about narratives, and I want to ask, how do stories and narratives about climate change futures help us understand the magnitude of the problem and its impacts on us personally, inspiring us to act without also terrifying us? Because again, we're looking at the reports that say, essentially we're doomed, and then we want, through quantum social change, we want people to realize that no, we're actually not doomed. So how do stories, how do narratives bring people into this, and kind of make them feel connected, that entangled sense that you've often spoken about?
Yeah, I think stories are so important. We live our lives through stories. We're always telling ourselves stories about what happened this morning, or we share stories and things. But then, sometimes we get like bought into the story of that, oh, I can't do anything, this doesn't matter, this is not important, or we're headed for an apocalypse or things, and we don't have that, like, every story has that protagonist. It has an agent of change, and so the hero's journey in the story. And I think that where we have to be able to to tell a different story about the future and recognize that we're writing it. That it's very easy to tell, to kind of extrapolate the past to the future for a dystopian narrative, and recognizing that that dystopia, like for many people on the planet, it is dire right now. It is that we're seeing like those, and for many communities, they've been seeing it for centuries and things. So how do we actually tell a story that is, imagining that the possibilities that for doing things very differently right here and right now, and in the like the calling for stories to empower quantum social change, those types of stories are about our connection with each other, our connection with nature, our entanglement. It's a very but they're not like utopian or all is well and all this, because they acknowledge the losses, and being able to hold a both and perspective, and the paradox of we have no time, but this is the time to act. And there's a lot of, I think, the shifts that we have to experience are through the way we talk about climate change with each other, and to move from a very disempowering narrative that doesn't leave us room to make that difference to an empowering narrative that acknowledges that losses and the importance of adaptation and mitigation, but recognizes the essential need for transformations.
Yeah, I think you're starting to see some of that in some children's literature, right there. You've got that sense. Andy?
Thank you all. This was a tremendous contribution. Thank you, Dr. Karen O'Brien, for the rich opportunity to engage you in conversation and to hear and learn more about your vital and timely work. Thank you to our interviewers, Kathy Grimes and Laura Nagel. You've been listening to Trustees Without Borders interview with Dr. Karen O'Brien. I'm your host, Andy Morikawa. Trustees Without Borders is a podcast production of the Virginia Tech Institute for Policy and Governance. Trustees Without Borders features leading practitioners, thinkers, writers, and designers, all working to strengthen community capacity for innovation and creative change. You can find an archive of Trustees Without Borders interviews and other information at our website, www.ipg.vt.edu. Until next time, remember that as trustees of community, we all may work without borders or limits on our ideas and aspirations, without borders on what we think is possible to solve problems that keep us from achieving a just, inclusive community that works for us all.